Hi, and welcome, and thank you for watching our first debate presented by The Northerner. Today we're going to be discussing the issue of homosexuality in regards to society, the church, and specifically the North Central campus. I want to thank our two participants. On my left we have Drew Poehl, who is a junior music performance major, and on my right we have Kristin Wileman, a junior journalism major. And I want to first give you both an opportunity to make an opening statement. I want to start with Kristin on that.
Yeah. So today you're going to hear me argue the stand that homosexuality is a sin and that it is not biblically justified. This is not a popular view to hold, particularly in society. This past summer I lived in Washington, D.C. when the Supreme Court ruled that gay marriage was legal in all 50 states. I answered phone call after phone call of people calling my congresswoman spewing hate toward homosexual people. My heart broke as I walked past rainbow celebrations, not because I was angry at their legal right, but because they so enthusiastically embraced a lifestyle of sin. I hope everything I say today reflects my attitude of hope for those who struggle with their sexual identities. I fully believe that God heals and restores, but I also believe that we must be willing to stand up even when it's unpopular against sin. My intentions are not to deepen wounds already caused by the church, but to stand for what I believe is right and offer redemption.
Thank you. And Drew, would you like to make a statement?
So first I just wanted to thank the Northerner for giving me the opportunity. I'm going to be saying some things. I hope that they all come across with the same idea of, I hope that the idea of loving everybody first comes across, and that although a lot of our opinions might be disagreeable, I hope that people just, have the mind to listen and really think about what we're saying.
Thank you. For our first question, one thing that is often a topic of debate is the source of homosexual attractions. And I want to ask, is homosexuality the result of nature or nurture? I'm going to start with Drew on that.
So some of the thoughts I have on this, I think that even just as a very foundation, you could argue that since it happens at all, that it could be natural. And the idea that we live in a natural world, so anything that occurs in it has natural causes. And you can argue for supernatural things, like sin is technically a supernatural idea. And you can definitely argue for that, but just the idea that it does happen in nature is one of my main points that I wanted to make. Another thing is, there are over 1,500 known animal species that are practice homosexuals. So the idea to say that it's completely unnatural is a little bit far-fetched to me. One of our closest evolutionary relatives, the dwarf chimpanzee, the entire species is actually known to be bisexual, in which, they don't really have necessary gender roles that they really hold to very strictly at all. Also, just to note, statistically, if you break it down of how many people say that they have homosexual tendencies or any temptation like that, it's just as frequently occurring as being dyslexic, or even you could stretch it to be left-handed by some calculations as well. So all in all, I would say that it is more a result of nature more than nurture. I do feel that nurture definitely plays a part in a lot of situations, but overall I do believe it to be a natural occurrence.
I'm going to let Kristin respond to that.
Yeah, I guess I kind of come to it from the opposite side of things, which is why we are debating this. But I do believe that this is a result of nurture over nature. While I was talking with my pastor from home, and just kind of get a feel for how what his experience has been with dealing with people who have had homosexual tendencies. And in his experience, he estimated that in his over 30 years of ministry that all but one person, he said the number to be at about 40 people that he's talked with that had this, have dealt with this problem, but that all but one of them were abused at an early age, or they had some kind of traumatic event in their childhood or in their growing up years that skewed with their sexuality. That being said, obviously that isn't the case for all people. There are some people who are just, for whatever reason, they're attracted to the people of their same sex instead of people of the opposite gender. But one thing that is clear, and that science has not proven that it is factual that someone is born with a gay gene. There is a lot of research on that, but no conclusive evidence has been given regarding that. So, and I think for me, we were just talking, I'm not an expert on this field by any means, but I do believe that God did create man and woman, which can get really, I don't know, some people can be very upset about that, but I do believe that's how we were created, and that in childhood, we're very malleable for the first about over 20 years of our lives. And when things as delicate as sexuality are messed with at that time, it's very easy to become confused. And I think that that is a lot of times where people develop feelings of homosexuality.
Mm-hmm. And Drew, you mentioned that you were arguing in favor of it being a natural occurrence. So would you say that homosexuality is not a choice?
I would say that it is not entirely a choice in the way that it's like a conscious decision that somebody just decides, okay, today I'm going to be attracted to my same sex. I don't necessarily think it's a choice in that way, but a lot of gender identities or roles aren't necessarily a influence of nature or nurture or the circumstances they brought up in, but again, as you were saying, a lot of it is that crucial period in our development that like a traumatic event or anything like that can kind of change perspective. So not necessarily that it's a choice to have the tendencies. I feel like the main choice that we should focus on as Christians especially is what you decide to do with what you're given as far as the feelings that you have.
And Kristin, do you have a response to that?
I definitely agree with what you were saying about how we as Christians respond to it, and I know that's something we're going to touch on later, so I won't get too far into that right now, but yeah, I just think that it's important that we realize, like, regardless of whether it is nature or nurture, that it is not biblical, and that acting out on homosexual tendencies and on homosexual desires is not scripturally relevant, and or not relevant, but it's not scripturally acceptable, and that throughout the Old and New Testament that it was spoken out against. And yeah, I think we as the church need to figure out better ways on how to address it, regardless of whether the fact that it is nature or nurture.
And so, Kristin, do you believe that someone who does identify as a sexual can change, and what does that look like?
Oh, I definitely think that it is something that that can be changed. In 1 Corinthians 6, it talks a lot, and that's kind of the main verse that a lot of Christians take on the fact that homosexuality is unacceptable. And it's also been a verse that has been very abusive towards people who do live in that lifestyle. And so it just says, or do you not know that the unrighteous shall not inherit the kingdom of God? And then it lists out, not be deceived, neither fornicators, idolaters, effeminate, homosexuals, or thieves, covetous, drunkards, revilers, swindlers, shall inherit the kingdom of God. But then this next verse is really where I think that this comes in. It says, and such were some of you, but you were washed, you were sanctified, but you were justified in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ in the Spirit of our God. And so I think right there it says, this is what we're dealing with, but you can be delivered from it. And I think that's probably the most important part of that. It's not such are some of you, it's such were some of you. And that right there it shows that regardless of the fact that it is a sin, it's something that Jesus can come and he can sanctify us. He can take those feelings away, and he can rectify us toward God in that matter.
Mm-hmm. And Drew, what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I kind of almost view homosexuality in the same way that I view a lot of, almost like addictions in a lot of ways, because if you have these desires or temptations or anything, I imagine it from my perspective. I've had it explained to me in the same way that it's like, it's just putting something above God. It's almost an addiction in that way. And to say that we can't overcome homosexuality seems absurd to me in the same way that, I mean, if we do agree on the fact that it is a sin, then to say that we can't be delivered from it seems absurd. God would never put something greater than what he'd be able to help us with. I mean, there isn't a sin listed in the Bible that's like you aren't able to be delivered from. And in that way, I feel like I kind of agree with you that it's definitely something that I don't necessarily think that you can change in the idea that you can stop necessarily having these desires or having the temptation, but I feel like you can definitely stop sinning in that. And I think putting God first is probably the biggest step towards that.
All right, now we're going to move on to our second area of discussion. Kristin, church has often been criticized in how they've handled homosexuality, including members within the church. Do you agree with this criticism, and how can the church handle homosexuality more effectively?
Yeah, well, I think it's a pretty blanket statement to say that the church has not handled homosexuality the best in the past. And, you know, I am not part of the generation. You know, I think a huge part of this happened like 20, 30 years ago. In that time, I do think it's gotten better, but most definitely the church has been very abusive of people in the past. You know, you look online and you'll find horror stories of people who say they walked into the church and, you know, they were told to leave because they were homosexual, or, you know, stories like that that break my heart and that I think are very wrong. I do not think that that's what Jesus would do. And that's not what Jesus did. You know, Jesus came across people with messed up sexualities all the time. When he was on earth, you know, he saw the woman who had been with multiple men, and that's the verse that a lot of people use, you who have not sinned, cast the first stone. But I think a lot of times the church looks at this like something that's new to God, something that if we talk about it, that it's almost a hot button topic. And it is. It's a big deal, and it's something that definitely needs to be discussed. But I think more than discussing, the church needs to act on it. I think the church is not a place where perfect people can come and sit and edify themselves. And I think that has wrongfully become something that has been prevalent in our culture. But I think, you know, the church's place is to bring people in who are struggling and who are in need of restoration and who are in need of grace. And that's our duty. That's our duty as Christians, is to reach out and accept the people who are hurting. But I think with acceptance, we must also preach truth. And I think that is kind of a fuzzy area where, you know, we want to be accepting, but we don't want to point out faults either. And so I think one thing the church needs to do is find that line between reaching out to people and bringing them in and being the church and showing love and showing redemption, and also still preaching truth and standing on what is biblical and, you know, stating what we do believe is true.
And Drew, would you agree with Kristin's assessment?
Absolutely. I feel like one of the biggest words that you use there is acceptance, and I feel like that's probably one of the most misinterpreted terms when it comes to how we view church and its members. It's not necessarily, I feel like the homosexual community comes into the church with the expectation that kind of just like take us as we are and don't correct us necessarily, because they don't, a lot of homosexuals don't necessarily think that it's a sin. And I think that's, I feel like, again, you also said that we need to act as well. And I think the first step is addressing ignorance in the church, and not necessarily like just talking about it or anything like that, but I feel like we need to understand more about the issue. And kind of, I feel like there's a lot of people that I've talked to personally that don't I wouldn't want them talking to any of the homosexual friends I have trying to get them to come to their church. It wouldn't work out. And then I think that acting is definitely the second step to that. And then again, going back to acceptance, we don't accept the members of our churches currently in the sin that they're in. And this kind of goes back to points we were making earlier, like sin is sin no matter what, and we don't accept who we are in our sin. We accept who we are in Christ. And I feel like that idea needs to be conveyed more clearly. And it's not necessarily that every church doesn't, but I feel like that's probably one of the biggest points that gets missed, and that gets kind of lopped into the rejection that a lot of people see as well.
Dren, one thing you mentioned, you said that there is ignorance in the church. Can you maybe expand on that and maybe how we address that? Just from personal experience, I've talked to many people who don't necessarily view homosexuality in a healthy way. I think a lot of people don't put themselves in other people's shoes very well. And I feel like that's probably the number one thing that we need to do is, what if I were them? And it's not always an easy thing to do, but I feel like it's something that we need to do to be able to relate to that. And I mean, I've heard people say, oh, why would we want them in our church? But that's not the right idea at all. It should totally be trying to include everybody and build them up, not just throw them to the wolves. And Kristin, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I definitely don't disagree with anything you said. I just think a lot of times in the church, we're scared. We don't know where the balance is between acceptance and calling things out. I think a lot of times by wishing to not offend, we withhold a cure from the people. And so by being afraid of topics such as homosexuality, a lot of sexual things that are kind of hush-hush in the church that people don't want to talk about, we withhold what we could be doing for them. And in preparation for this, I was just watching some videos, particularly on Cy Rogers. If you remember him, he spoke here last year. But his testimony, and he said that when he was trying to find restoration from being a homosexual, that he went to church and he was expecting to walk in and be shut down, but he was offered an arena where people were willing to accept him and take him under and not be afraid. I think, a lot of times there's a lot of fear of, if I accept this person, does that mean that people are going to think we're partners or that we're, I'm this way as well? And I think a lot of it is getting over ourselves and just being willing to maybe look dirty, to, maybe get some mud on our shoes and to go in and help people and not just think it's the pastor's job, not think that it's not my problem, but to realize that as the body of Christ, this is my obligation, this is my duty. I need to step out and help this person because that's what Jesus would have done, that's what we should be doing.
And you both have mentioned acceptance but taking a biblical stance on homosexuality. So I want to ask Kristin, is there a distinction between taking a religious stance against homosexuality and being homophobic?
Oh, definitely. I think homophobic would be people who you see someone and you run the other direction. And that's the opposite thing that we should be doing. We should be running toward the lost and not away from them. The thing that is, in the church, there's a lot, I think there's also a lot of media that tells the church what the church is, and that says, this is how the church reacts. And so there are a lot of those expectations kind of already predisposed upon the church. And I think that's unfortunate, but it's also our job to do those wrong. And we should absolutely not be homophobic. If, when you walk down the sidewalk and you see a homosexual couple, I think the last thing you should be doing is going, oh, gross, that's just not, I could never imagine doing that. And while you couldn't, I couldn't, but that doesn't mean that we should have that visceral reaction to people. who are of same-sex attraction. But I think our response should be more one of reaching out to people, just like you would reach out to someone who is doing drugs or who is an alcoholic or anything like that. It should be the church opening their arms and accepting them in, teaching their people how to react to things like that, and then showing them Jesus and working with them through their problems instead of seeing the problems and having that be just the red line that you can't get away from.
Thank you. And Drew, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to that, and also want to ask, how have you personally seen homophobia in the church?
Yeah, I think there's a big difference between, I think a big line that gets drawn is people will say that they don't want to be tolerant of sin, and then homosexuality specifically. But I think the biggest difference is like intolerance versus homophobia is completely different to me. I really liked your definition of homophobia, of just running the other way. We should never be disgusted or repelled by other people's sin. I don't feel like that's what Jesus ever did. He saw sin and he ran to it and he tried to help people. And I think that should be more of our approach, not necessarily just like throwing it to the side as something that's just completely absurd to us or something like that. As far as what I've seen in the church, it's kind of hard to pin down specific instances, but a lot of times, I think you kind of nailed it on the head too. A lot of times I think the church gets told what they are, and I don't feel like that's healthy either, because that's not how it works. You are who you are, and caring about what other people think of you, that's not something Jesus did either. And I haven't necessarily personally seen a lot of direct homophobia, you could say, in the church, but I feel like we've all been able, it's not very hard to look up a horror story.
And Kristin, another debate with homosexuality in the church is, should those who live in a homosexual lifestyle be allowed to be a member of the church and even at some points take leadership positions? And I want to know what your thoughts on that are.
Yeah, that's a tough call. And I think it's something that, well, there are a lot of different opinions on it, but I do think that in leadership positions that those leaders are held to a higher standard. But then again, you get into murky waters when you say, but this person struggles with greed and he's in leadership, or she struggles with fill in the blank. We all struggle with stuff, and I think that should also be a bottom line for this, is that we're all sinners and we're all in need of grace, and so are people who struggle with same-sex attraction. If I had to give a yes or no answer to should people who are in homosexual relationships be involved in leadership in the church, I would say no. I think that leaders portray an example that other people should follow, and that are called to a higher standard, a higher calling. And I don't think that people who are actively involved in homosexual relationships should be involved in leadership in the church.
Drew, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things I see is homosexuality is a very visible sin. A lot of times, you can hide it to an extent, but a lot of times it's, especially if you're in a relationship, a lot of times, there's no hiding it. Things like greed or even lust to an extent, those are hideable sins. So, how many pastors have we seen that have, fallen, you could say. So to say that we should all, we definitely shouldn't expect perfection from our leaders, but I definitely agree. We should hold them to a higher standard, especially, if we know something, we should want correction, and so should our leaders in that way. So I definitely agree.
Would you be willing to see someone in a leadership position at church if they are pushing for change in their life?
Absolutely. I think Cy Rogers is a really good example of that. I'm glad that you brought it up. But I would be more than happy to have somebody like that be a pastor. If anything, I would be more strengthened by that. Or if I had a pastor who's like, I openly struggle with greed, so here's my tithing record or something like that. I would be ecstatic if something like that happened. But I don't think that happens a lot with anybody. But yeah, I would be okay with that happening.
And I'd like to move to our final area of discussion. I would like to read part of the Christian Community Life Standards here at North Central. It says, certain practices are forbidden in Scripture and will not be tolerated in the lives of members of the university community. Those practices include pornography, sexual relationships out of marriage, promiscuity in any form, cohabitation, and homosexuality. Normally, when someone at North Central comes out as gay, they will be given a mentor and allowed to have meetings with them. And if they show that they are willing to change in their life, they will be allowed to stay at North Central. But if they don't believe they can or are not willing to, then they're usually asked to leave. And I want to ask Drew, does NCU's policy correctly handle the issue of homosexuality?
As an initial statement, I would say yes. I think a lot of those, it's such a case-by-case thing, it seems like to me. There's so many factors or variables that play into what the course of action from the university actually is. I think one of the biggest things to consider is, are they like recognizing that it is sin, and are they trying to like seek reconciliation for it? And I think this kind of goes back to points we've made multiple times of, I mean, all sin is still sin. So, I mean, again, this is more of a continuous temptation kind of a thing, and it doesn't seem like something that would be able to just like be cleaned up really quickly. But if someone is striving to, follow God and do the right thing, I don't think they should necessarily get kicked out. And in that way, I think North Central handles it pretty well from what I've heard. The thing that really becomes a problem is when people are unwilling or disagree. And in that stance, I don't really think it's wrong of North Central to ask anyone to leave, because being the private university, we have the standards that we hold to, and we expect every one of our students to be able to maintain that standard. So if we can openly prove that somebody's not doing that, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask them to leave.
And Kristin, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that North Central actually does an excellent job with this process. As a member of Residence Life Leadership, I have been able to see this firsthand, and I really see this as a method of reconciliation, which is a word I've used multiple times today. And I think that it's actually something that I wish the church would model itself after, where you see someone who has a need, someone who is willing to confess and wants help in an area, and instead of brushing them away, that you take them and they confess what's wrong, and then there are courses of action that can be taken. So a lot of times what that looks like is a series of, like you said, mentorship, a lot of that meetings with people who are experts on this topic, going to counseling sessions at the Student Success Center, reading books, writing reports, doing things like that, just so that it's a healing process and not just a let's put a Band-Aid on this process. And so I think that North Central does a very, very good job at offering hope and at offering restoration instead of just, someone coming out and then they're kicked out of the school.
Thank you. And Drew, I want to ask, do you believe North Central is a safe place, or a comfortable place for someone who might feel like they struggle with homosexuality?
I would say yes and no. I think it kind of depends on the means by which you would come out. I feel like there's a lot of confidentiality between, I feel like our residence life student leadership system is very solid. And if you come to your RA and be like, hey, I'm struggling with this, I need to get counseling, I don't feel like there's anything wrong with that. I don't think you're going to get rejected by anyone or anything like that. If you go on your Facebook and post, hey guys, this is what's up now, I feel like there might be a little bit more backlash to that. And I don't necessarily know why, but I feel like people don't necessarily handle it with love right away, which I feel like, I mean, our counselors, our RAs, everything, they're taught to do things this way. And if it's brought to the public mind or the student body like that, it might not always be handled as sensitively.
Okay. And Kristin, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that we, as a student body, have a lot of area to grow, a lot of room to grow in this particular area. I think that, in general, people who struggle with things here have a hard time sharing it. And that's something that I wish that we could change, and that I hope I'm facilitating change in that area, where we're a safer place to talk about struggles and to talk about our lives rather than just burying it and letting that sin infect us to the point where when we leave, it consumes us. So I think like North Central staff and Res Life, I think that they do a fantastic job dealing with it, but at a student level, I would like to see change there, where it's more of a community surrounding people rather than isolating them for certain sins, whether it is homosexuality or if it's stealing or whatever. It's a support system coming around them and willing to help rather than isolation, like I said before.
Thank you. And I actually want to stay with you. With the recent Supreme Court decision, North Central is able to, they have an exception with discrimination against homosexuality, it being a private institution. But with this becoming more of a human rights issue instead of a religious rights issue, do you think North Central will have a problem keeping that exemption in the future?
Yeah, there is a lot of unknown in that realm. I think with the Supreme Court decision, there are a lot of things that a lot of people are very concerned about, some justifiable, some not justifiable. I do think that down the road that this could be a huge deal for North Central. I know there are people in government who are wanting to make this so that institutions cannot have policies such as North Central has, especially, as you said, because it is becoming a human rights issue more than a religious or social rights issue. I think probably the biggest way that it could affect us would be through our federal funding, which would be a huge hit to so many students who attend here. But if the government would be unwilling to still provide federal funding for students and financial aid because of our policies, and especially in regard to homosexuality. But I don't know if that's in the foreseeable future. I hope it's not. I do appreciate how we have not become watered down in North Central, because this is what we believe, that they're not pushing the line further back and being afraid of the controversy that could happen because of it. Because I think that's something that's easy to do, and that unfortunately some churches are doing, where they just don't talk about it and hope that no one asks questions, but that we as an institution are still very upfront about it, and are, again, willing to help people change and to become better and to become more holy, but are also drawing those firm lines.
Thank you. Drew, I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people have a lot of fear surrounding what might happen in the future. And again, some justified, some not. You bring up a very interesting point of North Central losing its federal funding. I think that could happen in a near future situation. I certainly would hope that wouldn't happen. I don't feel like it's necessarily as political of an issue as it should be. Because North Central is still a university, no matter the tenets that we necessarily hold to, and I think that the idea behind federal funding of students to go to school shouldn't be thrown out the door just because some people might say that we're discriminating against somebody, even though I really don't feel like we are necessarily. And I would also hope that if the time did come where it was federal funding or stay true to your beliefs, I would hope that North Central would be able to still stay true to its beliefs like it has. I feel like we haven't been watered down by our society. I feel like we are still very authentic with our policy that we do carry out. And I definitely appreciate that, and I hope that we can, as a university and as a whole, be able to maintain that.
Thank you. And then, Kristin, with this becoming such a prevalent issue in society, how can the North Central community, student body, faculty, and staff continue to improve in how we address the issue at hand?
Yeah, I think that one big thing is just education, that we need to be informed. And I think, we talk about the North Central bubble all the time, and it is a real thing, but I think we also need to be aware and be informed of what's going on. People need to stay current on their news. People need to not hear about everything through BuzzFeed on Facebook. Just things like that is really important that we do. I always appreciate it when a chapel speaker preaches about things like homosexuality or things that are maybe not talked about as much. And I've very much appreciated Dr. Anderson's Friday sermons this year that have touched on that. But I think that's one big thing, is staying informed. We need to not be afraid of this issue. We need to be prepared in how we do respond to that in ministry and in our places of work, and regardless of where we're going, if it's the church or the business place in the future.
And Drew, I'd like to ask you the same question.
I think one of the biggest things that we need to do is stay on the front line of a lot of these issues. We shouldn't be afraid of any of these. We should be the most well-equipped group of people to be able to help people going through situations like this. And I absolutely agree. We should be well-educated, and we should be the forefront of. I don't really know how to put it. We should be at the front of trying to help in situations like this, where it's a lot of times societal unrest in this kind of situation. We should be solid with where we are. I feel like a lot of times issues like this has been brought up of continuity and staying consistent throughout the whole thing. I think that's something we need to do, while also being able to adapt to how different people are experiencing problems.
We're coming to the conclusion of our discussion, but before we wrap things up, I want to give both of our participants a chance to make a closing statement, and I'd like to start with Drew on that.
So the main things that I want to stand out as being the main points, the real important stuff that we were getting at is, again, and I said this at the beginning, the first and most important thing is just to outright just love people. That might look a lot different to a lot of people, but I feel like that comes through, again, talking about it, being educated, and then acting on it as well. The student body has been making great strides, I think, towards conversation, intelligent conversation. And again, chapel speakers have been talking about this stuff. This isn't necessarily, and even the fact that we're doing this debate now, it's healthy that we're addressing things, and I feel like we need to continue to do that to be able to stride for progress in a lot of these areas.
And Kristin?
Yeah, definitely. Just reiterate what you said there, that, regardless of, whether it's nature or nurture and the different things that we've talked about, just that we as Christians need to be the front runners in loving people. And I think a lot of times we're painted as the opposite, as people who are just constantly condemning and telling people they're going to hell and doing things like that. And we need to be educated, and we need to be bold, but we also need to love and have compassion and show grace and mercy. And I think if we can get that down, and we can, even while we're here in our community where it may not be one of the biggest issues that people here struggle with, while some do, if we can get that down, we're going to be much better equipped when we go out into the world and we are daily faced with these kinds of issues. And if we can just love people first, love God first, then love people, and just show grace and not be afraid, not be homophobic like we were talking about before, but just extending the invitation to people to come to Christ and to be willing to be to show grace to them when they do walk into our lives.
And that'll be the conclusion of our discussion. I want to thank both of our participants. Thank you, Drew.
Yeah.
And thank you, Kristin. And I want to thank you for watching. I hope this discussion facilitates a great conversation around campus. I'm looking forward to hearing your responses, your feedback, and your thoughts on this topic of homosexuality. The Northerner will be doing more of these in the future, and I hope you look out for those. And once again, I want to thank you for watching. Thank you for the time to engage in this topic, and I hope you'll be looking out for the next one. Thank you.